Howdy, my name's Tom Austin. I'm an ecologist and a land conservationist down here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina, specifically the Sea Islands. And today I want to talk to you about how bird populations and bird distributions have changed here in South Carolina over the last couple of decades, as well as just the last decade that I've been a bird watcher. So I started my career as a conservationist about 10 years ago. And about that same time, I also took up bird watching as a hobby. And just over the last 10 years, I've seen significant changes in bird distribution right here on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. This area of the country right here, just south of Charleston, South Carolina, is kind of right at the front line of the bleeding edge, the margin of the subtropical zone. And as such, we're seeing a lot of changes in a lot of different taxons of species as far as their distribution goes. Species that are leaving the state and they're moving up northward, and species that are coming up from Florida and going into the state, as well as other species that are just moving their range from all over, filling in, new habitat, novel new habitat as it's created. They're being moved around by people, or habitat restoration or population, preservation efforts have just reached a point where these populations have recovered to the point where they're now recolonizing historic habitat. So I just want to talk about how, this has changed for a lot of bird species here in South Carolina since the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, as well as just what I've seen here in the 2010s. And the medium I want to use to show this to you is this golden field guide to the birds of North America that my mom has had for probably 30 or 40 years. This was given to her by her brother, my uncle, and I remember flipping through this book, my entire childhood. It's always just kind of been, sitting on the shelf by the windowsill right next to, the pair of binoculars she's had, since she was my age. So I just got to thumbing through this thing again this morning while I was drinking my coffee, and I noticed there's a bunch of species that are shown to be, fairly common here on the coast of South Carolina that, it's been years or potentially never that I've seen one. And then there are others that are, shown as being rare, scarce, hard to find, or not even here that, I've seen, a dozen, 100 in the last year. So what I've done is gone through here and just marked all the species that have sort of colonized South Carolina in the last several decades, and those that have, either become far less abundant or disappeared. And I just want to go through this, page by page with you and just show you, where birds have changed. Some of these are, just natural changes. Some are influenced by, warming climate, rising seas. Others are influenced by changes in available habitat. And others are just declining due to habitat losses, either elsewhere in the country or South America. And some are booming because of, habitat restoration efforts here in South Carolina or changes in habitat elsewhere in the state that have caused species to move. So just wanted to flip through these real quick, and I don't really have any super deep, details on all of this for you, but just wanted to, highlight it for you. And if you're interested in some of these species, go look it up and, see what potentially is causing these changes in maybe some of these favorite species of yours. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So the first one I want to show you is the brown pelican here. And if you can see over here on the range map, it shows that they're kind of just barely found in a couple of spots all along the, eastern seaboard. Nowadays, they're super common all around, the coast of South Carolina. And that's because pelicans were, their populations were decimated around the turn of the century, and they were really close to the brink. But they have rebounded thoroughly. I mean, in fact, right out here on this creek, I see, dozens a day chasing the crab man as he comes in and out picking up crab traps. That's one species that has it was ravaged by, unintended consequences of man, and it's just back to more or less historic numbers, at least here in the low country of South Carolina. Another one right below that is the American white pelican, which is shown as not really being on the coast of South Carolina, even in winter. Nowadays, they're fairly reliable to find here, right along the coast this time of winter, at least here in the Ace Basin where I am. Real quick, another one kind of like that is the tundra swan. They're not shown as being here in coastal South Carolina at all, but regularly every year there's about 100 that come down to Bear Island right in the heart of the Ace Basin, and they've been consistent for well over 10 years now. Here's an interesting one. The mottled duck. As you can see down here, the mottled duck is not found in South Carolina. They're now all over the Ace Basin. They're all over Edisto Island. They're all over Bear Island. They're down in Beaufort. And that's because we put them here. South Carolina DNR translocated mottled ducks from the Gulf Coast and Florida to the Ace Basin of South Carolina in order to create a stable, huntable population. And they have flourished in the managed rice impoundments and other tidal brackish wetlands here in the Ace Basin of South Carolina, and they are now thoroughly entrenched. DNR's plan of creating a huntable, stable population was a complete and total success. But now there's concerns about them potentially moving down the coast because they've done so well that they're spreading into Georgia, and they might start bleeding over into the Florida population and kind of affecting their genetics. The Florida population is seeing some interesting pressure. Feral domestic mallards have been released out into the marshes, and they've been breeding with the mottled ducks, and the gene flow of mallard DNA into the mottled ducks is compromising the integrity of this fairly threatened species, as well as it's making their offspring, the hybrids, less adapted to living in the salt marsh, and it's kind of changing what a mottled duck is down there. But the ones here are doing very well, and we have basically an artificial population right here in the heart of South Carolina Lowcountry. Here's one that's interesting. The black-bellied whistling duck and the fulvous whistling duck. When I was taking my college course on field identification of wildlife, they didn't even talk about black-bellied whistling ducks, but they said the fulvous whistling duck is one that is kind of nomadic, and it just shows up in South Carolina every once in a while. I have been on the eBird notification list for fulvous whistling duck for the last 10 years, and there has not been a single report, I don't think, of one in South Carolina. But black-bellied whistling ducks are thick as rats in the Ace Basin now. They're cavity nesting birds, and they have taken 2 wood duck boxes in brackish and tidal, brackish and freshwater impoundments where wood ducks are, isn't their preferred habitat. They're not wooded enough. They're a little overexposed. The black-bellied whistling ducks have gotten in there, and they have been breeding like rats. All over the Ace Basin. When I started birding back in 2014, a black-bellied whistling duck seen practically anywhere in the state was a rare report. I saw 14 casually the other day just standing in impoundment, and then I went to another property and saw another 14. They're having 2-3 broods a year down on Edisto Island. They're no longer a rare duck here in at least in the Ace Basin of South Carolina. But at the same time, I haven't even seen a report of a fulvous whistling duck, I don't think. Here's one that surprised me this morning when I saw it. Mississippi kite. As you can see in there, they're not even in South Carolina, which you wouldn't be able to guess nowadays. They're about 2 to 3 times more common than swallowtail kites, even in, peak swallowtail kite habitat. It's hard that you can even, go an hour in, peak of the summer without hearing Mississippi kites flying overhead, screeching and caterwauling. So those are now thoroughly here. They come here every summer, and they're as dependable as can be. Here's a classic one. Bald eagle. Rare and locally common. Basically not shown to be in South Carolina year round. While I'm recording this video, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 that fly over. I'm right on the corner of a creek, and they cut this corner, screaming, screeching, locking talons, hollering, flipping around. South Carolina, especially after the creation of the hydroelectric dams, as well as here in the Ace Basin, is kind of one of the strongest populations of bald eagles on the, eastern seaboard. It's hard to go anywhere with water here in South Carolina nowadays and not see at least one bald eagle, if not find a nest, a breeding pair, and last year's young. As well as osprey. Osprey are shown to only be summer residents here. This cosmopolitan species has completely rebounded after the banning of DDT, and they're now prevalent all across the coast of South Carolina year-round. Here's one. I haven't even looked this up yet, but it just weirds me out. The plain chachalaca, or however that's pronounced. I haven't even looked it up. I don't know how it's pronounced, but there is a population noted here in Savannah, Georgia. I've never even heard of this species. So I don't know what that was about. It was probably some, relocated naturalized species from Mexico, but I'm actually going to go look that up after this video, and I'll probably put something, on screen right here, but I never even heard of that bird. I guess while I'm on this page too, the wild turkey. See how spotty that distribution is? They're all over the eastern United States now. Fun fact, we practically extirpated the wild turkey from the eastern United States. The Francis Marion National Forest here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina was one of the last remaining strongholds of the species here in the southeast. And a lot of the turkeys that have been, bred in Georgia, North Carolina, all across here in the southeast are right here from the low country of South Carolina. It's the same with white-tailed deer. We actually traded Georgia turkeys for deer because we practically didn't have any deer left. That is just absurd to think about. Here's another one. I don't know, necessarily how accurate this map is, but it shows snowy egrets were only found here in the low country in winter. They're here year-round, thick as thieves. That is a species that was hunted aggressively and with prejudice, in the late 1800s for the millinery trade. This is one of the species that, was the impetus behind the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, because these birds were hunted practically to extinction for their frilly plume feathers during breeding season. Because of that, they were being hunted where they were, their populations were the densest at the most vulnerable time of the year, and they got hit really hard, but they have rebounded thoroughly here on the coast. I guess, again, while I'm on this page, cattle egrets are another interesting one to talk about. They were here, when this book was published, but they have expanded extensively across the East Coast. If you don't know, cattle egrets are from Africa. They naturalized themselves. They are an exotic species to North America that got blown over into South America during a hurricane, it's theorized. And when they got there, normally there weren't any, cattle. I mean, they're adapted to following around, as you can see from this illustration down here. They're adapted to following around, cattle and, like wildebeest, out on the savannas of Africa. And so they've probably been blown over to the New World countless times over the last, several millennia. And there was never, a herd species down in South America for them to follow around and adapt to. And if there was, it went extinct many thousands of years ago. But when they got blown over to South America the last time, there were cows there because European colonization happened, and they spread up the East Coast from South America to Mexico and into the southeastern United States, and they're now entrenched in the U.S. They naturally spread across the coast. That's one of those strange. That's why not every exotic species is invasive, and not every naturalized species is unnatural. Cattle egret is a perfect example. They jumped the Atlantic Ocean on their own accord, and they're here to stay. Here's another conservation success: the wood stork. So as you can see on this map, they're not shown to be in South Carolina. And my mom remembers telling me stories of her and her cousins seeing a wood stork back in the 70s. And it was this absolutely ludicrous sighting. And now, they're, again, just like the snowy egrets, they're thick as rats. They're breeding here in the Ace Basin of South Carolina in multiple rookeries. They have rebounded dramatically. Actually, they're probably more common here in South Carolina than they used to be. And that bleeds into the next species on this one I want to talk about, the roseate spoonbill. This was a rare bird when I started birding back in 2014. There was only a handful that were reported every year in the state. Now there's routinely 50, 100, 200, 500 wintering. Juvenile birds, one-year birds, wintering here in the Ace Basin of South Carolina and actually throughout the coast, that are just here year-round. And they've even started to breed now. There's reports from James Island and a couple of other places. They are now here to stay, and they're more abundant than wood storks now in a lot of places. And so this is a species that has been dramatically impacted in its breeding and normal native range down in Florida, and they've become displaced. So they've moved up here to South Carolina, where we thankfully have had the foresight to conserve tons of land around the Ace Basin, and they have entrenched themselves here as kind of a new home. Actually, now that I think about it, I want to talk about flamingos real quick. So I'm just cutting this in right here after spoonbills. There has been now twice in the last 5 years a documented real natural flamingo here in South Carolina, and both times I'm confident they were pushed here from Cuba by a hurricane. So in 2017, just a couple weeks after Hurricane Irma, which kind of, I believe, came through Cuba and then went up across Florida and cut across the low country of South Carolina, a DNR biologist, shorebird biologist, took a photo of an American flamingo in Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, just north of Charleston Harbor. Just this year, Hurricane Ian, I believe, I've totally blanked on the name, swept through Cuba and went up the outside of Florida and pushed up towards Ohio. And there were dozens of flamingos that just got sprinkled all across the eastern U.S. There was about, I think, 10 or 11 that showed up on Bulls Island in Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge again. And there's one who's been named Jimmy, who's hung out year round now. He's been there for months now on Bulls Island. And so I think this is the beginnings of a trend. These flamingos, that first one that showed up in 2017, sure, it just got blew up here and it was able to slowly make its way back south without, expiring. These ones that came here after Hurricane Ian, there has been one that has been on Bulls Island perfectly healthy now for months. This might be the sign that flamingos are going to start moving up the eastern seaboard and maybe even get a foothold here in the Ace Basin. Or at least, up by Cape Romaine. Oh, and this is one that's happening right now in real time, limpkins. Limpkins are now spreading thoroughly up into the coastal plain of South Carolina. They've even been seen as far as up as, Clemson. And the reason for that is the hydroelectric dams have become colonized by, I think, Oriental apple snails. Though there's a native species of apple snail down in Florida that they feed on. It's actually the same with the snail kites. There have been, the last 5 years, there's been 2 reports of snail kites, one actually a week ago, here in South Carolina. And they're coming up, moving into these hydroelectric dams and feeding on this invasive apple snail. And so limpkins are now spreading into the coastal plain of South Carolina and eating an invasive species. When previously there was never anything for them to eat because that's what they're adapted to eating, is this apple snail. But this apple snail has now spread throughout all these native river systems and these man-made lakes, and the limpkins have followed suit. And potentially in the next decade or so, we might have snail kites entrenched here in South Carolina as well. You can quote me on that. Here's another one that's expanded. The American avocet, as well as the black-necked stilt. Not block that for you. So American avocets are now a pretty common sight here in the Ace Basin, into the, dozens and even hundreds, feeding in managed, old rice impoundments, managed tidal impoundments. Black-necked stilts are actually breeding here in South Carolina nowadays. So that's another 2 species that have expanded into South Carolina from elsewhere. Here's one, and again, I can't attest to the veracity of these maps, but it shows that Forster's terns are not found here in the summer. They are here year-round, and they are by far our most common tern. And now we're starting, as you can see, it's front-loaded on the species that have expanded into the state, and now we're moving on to the species that have declined significantly in the state. And the first one on that list here is the common ground dove. So the common ground dove used to be very common here in the state. It used to be found all over the barrier islands as well as the edges of fields, but kind of in the same way that the bobwhite has declined, the common ground dove has declined significantly, but more so due to coastal development. They're now a very scarce bird to find. They're not necessarily rare, but anytime you see one, you're like, oh, a ground dove. It's not like, oh, a ground dove. It's kind of how bobwhite quail have become. And I won't talk about the extinct species, but, we have Carolina parakeets that are extinct, Bachman's warblers that are now extinct. They're actually still in this book. My birding mentor was one of the last people still alive who's seen a Bachman's warbler in the flesh, which is just wild to think about. Ivory-billed woodpeckers are gone. The list goes on. So here's another one that's actually expanded, is the ruby-throated hummingbird. As you can see here, they're shown to only be in South Carolina in the summer, but there's now a fairly sizable population that overwinters here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina. And that's due to a combination of factors. Primarily, it's because of coastal development. This is a species that's actually benefited from coastal development to some degree, in that people are leaving out hummingbird feeders over winter, and that people are planting subtropical plants that flower in winter. And so hummingbirds actually have a food source. Normally, they leave South Carolina entirely because there's nothing there for them to eat. But now that the food source is there and being provided by non-native plants and artificial feeding, the hummingbirds are overwintering. And in that same vein, there's other species that were kind of known to venture into the state in the past, but the veracity really wasn't, well documented. But as the number of birders has increased, as well as the number of, winter food sources, things like black-chinned hummingbirds and rufous hummingbirds have actually, there's the last 5 or so years, there hasn't been a year where there isn't, a rufous, a black-chinned, an Allen's, or a broadtail even, that hasn't been overwintering in Charleston Harbor. And I have a kind of pet theory about why these hummingbirds are so common in Mount Pleasant, around Charleston Harbor, is I think they get to Mount Pleasant and there's just this massive wall of, ornamental plants as well as tons and tons of people putting out hummingbird food. And they get to Charleston Harbor and they look at how big that harbor is, and it's where the Sea Islands start, is I would really say is Charleston Harbor. It's kind of the official cutoff point. You can say what you want about Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms and Dewey's and the some of the other scattered islands and Cape Romaine, but I really say Charleston Harbor is the start of the Sea Islands. And I think they get there and there's something about the geology they notice, and they kind of see this spot. Additionally, migratory birds, oftentimes they come to about Charleston Harbor and they get down to about Kiowa, Edisto, and then they jump across the Gulf Coast at that point and fly down to the tropics. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for a lot of species. And I think some get to that point and they just decide, I'm good. I'm just going to stay here. And rufous hummingbirds are one of those species, as well as black chins have been getting fairly common recently. And they're stopping in Mount Pleasant and just staying the winter because it's warm enough and there's food for them. That's my theory, at least, and I'm sticking to it until someone proves me wrong. Here's another one, and again, I don't know the veracity of these maps, but the gray kingbird. I have not seen a lot of reports of these here in the States, and they've only been getting less and less common over the last 10 years. I think coastal development here in the Sea Islands has really impacted their ability, or I guess their willingness. It's whether it's worth their while to come this far north. I think there's so much more coastal development that they're just not really coming to the Lowcountry anymore because it's not worth their effort to leave Florida, where they can, they have a lot more native habitat, to come up here to this thin margin on the coast where their natural habitat has kind of disappeared. Another one is horned larks. This map right here shows horned larks, being kind of well distributed here on the coast of South Carolina, down in the coastal plain. And that was probably the case when we had a lot more agriculture here on the Sea Islands in the Lowcountry. But over the last 20 to 30 years, practically all of the truck cropping has stopped here in the Lowcountry, and I think the horned larks have left because the habitat is no longer there for them. So purple martins are a species that are believed to be a western species that Native Americans actually created kind of the first nest box program, I guess. I don't know what kind of nest box stuff was being done in, Eurasia, but Native Americans were providing, hauled out bottle gourds for purple martins to nest in millennia ago. And as a result, the eastern population of purple martins is now anthropogenically established here on the eastern U.S. When European, colonists came in, they were like, these martins are neat, and I like them. And so they just kept putting up nest boxes. And so the purple martins here on the coast are kind of just like the house finch. They're a non-native western species that's established here in the eastern U.S. due to, humans providing them the habitat they need. Not that anyone would say a purple martin is non-native nowadays, but the difference is really just how long they've been here. The western species nest in cactuses, and the ones here they only nest in human-provided nest boxes. I don't even know if there's any documented cases of them using natural cavities anywhere. I know there were some recent efforts to try and locate some stuff down in Florida, but I think that habitat was either destroyed by starlings or something, but I can't recall. But basically, the entire eastern population is dependent on humans, and they've adapted to that. And so that subspecies or variety, I guess, they're entirely dependent on us for nesting habitat. Jumping forward a good bit, here we have the ovenbird. The ovenbird is a species that I've seen in a lot of maps as being, an overwintering species here on the coast, but I can't tell you the last time I've seen an ovenbird on the coast. I think I maybe have only seen one, and I live here. So they're really not that abundant here on the coast of South Carolina. If they're overwintering here in the southeast, it's not here in the Ace, or at least it's not where I'm walking. Oh, here's a species that has also become far less abundant in South Carolina, is the evening grosbeak. I think they've had a lot of population declines, and this is one of those species, along with a lot of the finches, that they're prone to eruptions. They run out of food up north, and they sort of move down. And as they start running out of food, they start pushing further and further south. So if they have a really bad year, they'll push all the way down to South Carolina. Every time this species gets mentioned around my mom, she talks about how when she was laid up with a broken back watching birds, she had an evening grosbeak come and visit the feeder right here in this yard, right outside her window, right there. Um, I can count on one hand the number of evening grosbeaks that have been reported on eBird in the last 10 years. Um, they're just not coming this far south. Either that's because there's better habitat for them up north, or there's just not enough for them to deplete their food stores and have them really erupt. There's really only been one eruption in the last 10 years I can think of. So here's the last species I've got marked in here that has kind of expanded into South Carolina a bit more, and that's the painted bunting. So the painted bunting is starting to become a year-round resident here in the Ace Basin on the coastal plain of South Carolina from Charleston south. And I can tell you that about a month and a half ago, I had one of my feeder right here in the middle of January. It's been several years now that they have been year-round at Botany Bay Plantation down on Edisto Island. They're starting to become more and more abundant, and they're also starting to push more and more inland when they're here in summer. And there's that one in Central Park in New York, which was weird, but we won't talk about that one. So we have some more finches here, purple finches. Just like the evening grosbeak, they're getting more and more scarce here on the coast. And the same goes for pine siskins as well, which are here 2 pages later. It is very rare that I see a pine siskin here on the coast. And I can't guarantee that I can see a purple finch, in any given year. They're getting less and less common. But these are species that, again, as they eat up all their food stocks up north, they move further south. And either they're losing population and their population levels are dropping, and so they're not going through the food sources, or they're just not coming this far south anymore, either due to climate or, other environmental pressures. And another one on here, this is actually one I didn't mark, but it's another range expander, the house finch. This is a western species that has been able to adapt here to the eastern United States, and, it's been able to make use of habitats that people have provided, as well as just carved out its own niche here on the coast. They actually nest up here in Spanish moss, kind of like how a yellow-throated warbler does in my yard. But house finches are now thoroughly entrenched here on the coast. Another one that again, don't know the veracity of these maps, but dick thistle. I can't remember the last time I saw a dick thistle report here on the coast, but it shows them being here on the coast. I think they're just not common here anymore because we don't have the, brushy field habitat that they depend on to survive. Another two in that same vein are the grasshopper sparrow and the henslows. The grasshopper sparrows, they're super scarce now in South Carolina. They're still somewhat common up in the Midlands and in the Piedmont, where there's, still farming going on, still field edges, that kind of thing. But grasshoppers, I don't know if I've ever seen a grasshopper here on the coast. Sparrow, that is. I've seen plenty of normal grasshoppers. Henslow sparrows, I've actually seen, honestly, I've seen 2 Henslow sparrows. They're very rare here in South Carolina, and they're marked as being very rare. They're a threatened species. But I still think they're coming to the coast. I still think they're using the coast. They're probably not as abundant as they used to be, but I think they're probably still as, abundant as they historically were in the habitats that still exist. They're just rare to begin with. Leconce is another one that, just like the grasshopper sparrow, is getting rarer and rarer here in South Carolina. That's one I've still yet to see. And I can't guarantee in a given year that anyone will see one. And of course, them and henslows are fairly cryptic birds. They're very hard to get eyes on, but, we don't have a lot of yellow sparrows that hang out in fields nowadays. And, it's hard to mistake the white-throated for them. So they usually get seen when someone's looking. Some more sparrows, the Vesper sparrow. They're getting less and less common. I used to see them a lot in Clemson, but I'm not in Clemson anymore. I can't recall the last time or if I've even seen one on the coast before. Lark sparrows are also getting less and less common. They're not coming here to the East Coast as much anymore, and I think that's due to coastal development. Kind of like snow bunnings, they hang out on beaches a lot. And the beaches are getting more and more developed. The habitat is more and more disturbed. There's more and more people on the beaches in winter and less habitat for them to use. So they're just not coming to the east anymore. Another one that's just generally declining are field sparrows. We have less and less, agriculture going on here in the coast. And so I've seen field sparrow numbers slowly decline, and they're just not as abundant as they should be anymore. And lastly, here to end off, we have fox sparrows. So fox sparrows are shown to be, relatively common, all throughout South Carolina, but they're very hard to find. They're, There's a couple of spots I know of where I can go and find a fox sparrow reliably, but they're just not showing up on the coast like they should be. That's a species that, unless you're going where you know there are fox sparrows, you can't guarantee you're going to see one, even if you're in the right habitat. So that's really all I wanted to talk to you about. So it was a nice trip down memory lane, a nice bit of nostalgia to go through this today. But, there's a lot of doom and gloom when people come to talking about bird conservation, but there has been a lot of conservation success and a lot of bird expansions. And just looking at this book that I think this was published in the 60s and updated in the 80s, and I don't know how much got updated because there's some obvious stuff that definitely changed between the 60s and 80s that wasn't updated in here, but we were in a really bad state at the turn of the century for a lot of birds, for a lot of big birds after, the market hunting of birds and the millinery trade that resulted in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and then the DDT and other pesticides that were impacting birds substantially, especially large-bodied birds, as well as overhunting and other market hunting pressures and stuff way back, in the turn of the century, before the conservation movement, before the establishment of the North American model, and before the Threatened and Endangered Species Act. We've had a lot of success. So everything is not doom and gloom, but a lot of songbirds have been hit hard. And so I guess kind of what I want to say is that it's not all bad. There's a lot you see out there about people talking about birds, and it's always doom and gloom, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. But there's a lot of birds that are doing all right, but there's also a lot of birds that are hurting. And knowing that, we are actually doing good by a lot of species in a lot of regards. We're doing a lot better than we were. I think it's important for us to think about that a little bit more often. But at the same time, it's not all good. There are birds that are hurting, that do need our help now, but not all of them. And I guess that's really all I want to say, is it's not all bad. And sometimes we do right by some species, and sometimes we don't. And in the field of conservation, the field of ecology, the field of biology, we're always learning and we're always figuring out new things every single day about species that we never thought to ask. And stuff's getting better. And every one of us can do our part. You can be like me. You can be lazy and not mow your grass, and the birds love it. We can each play a small part, a small role in everything that we do. And if we all do that, it's probably going to help. So just be hopeful and do what you can. And birds are neat. And actually, one last thing before I let you go. If you like learning about, not just birds, but the flora and fauna of, the Sea Islands and the Lowcountry of South Carolina, I've got a book coming out. And hopefully, if nothing catches on fire and no one goes belly up, it should be out the end of this year, before the holiday season. So keep an ear out and keep your eyes peeled, because I'll be talking about that book a lot in here, because I gotta sell a lot of books so that I don't go bankrupt. And paper's expensive nowadays. Stay tuned if you want to learn more about the flora and fauna, the Lowcountry and the Sea Islands of South Carolina, because I'm going to be telling it to you straight from the horse's mouth about the last 10, 20, 30 years of experience I have with various different species and taxons living here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina as a 12th generation South Carolinian. So stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you then. Tom out.